"Are you out of your mind?" Brenda screeched, her expensive beige designer umbrella violently flipping inside out as a massive gust of relentless Seattle wind tore through the cul-de-sac. "No, Brenda, I'm being safe," I yelled back, leaning out the window of my idling truck. The freezing rain was pelting my face, but I honestly couldn't have cared less. I slammed the palm of my hand down hard on the center of the steering wheel. Honk! The sound wasn't a normal car horn. It didn't beep. It didn't toot. It didn't politely ask you to move out of the way. It was a concussive, chest-rattling, apocalyptic blast that echoed off the manicured facades of the surrounding two-story colonial homes. It was the kind of noise you expect to hear right before a freight train obliterates a stalled sedan on the tracks. "That is a literal train horn," she shrieked, clutching her pearls. Yes, she was actually wearing pearls to check her mailbox in a thunderstorm. "It's a legally mandated safety device." I grinned, wiping a stream of cold rainwater out of my eyes. I hit the wheel again. "Honk! You specifically said my wipers were a nuisance, Brenda. I'm just adapting to the circumstances for safety." To understand how we arrived at this glorious, ear-splitting crescendo of malicious compliance, we have to rewind. We have to go back to the inciting incident, the spark that lit the powder keg, or in this case, the squeak that summoned the demon. I live in Seattle, Washington. If you know anything about the Pacific Northwest, you know that precipitation isn't just weather here. It's a lifestyle, a constant companion, a moody roommate that refuses to move out. It drizzles, it mists, it pours, it spits, and occasionally it unleashes a biblical deluge. Therefore, your windshield wipers are arguably the most critical component of your vehicle. They are your lifeline. My daily driver is a 2008 Ford F-150. Her name is Betty. She has character. She has a few dents, she has a faint smell of old coffee and wet dog, and she runs like an absolute dream. Betty isn't the problem. The problem is the neighborhood I currently reside in. It's an upscale, highly sanitized suburban enclave called Whispering Pines, a place where the grass is legally required to be exactly 2.5 inches tall, and your trash cans must be hidden behind a privacy screen lest they offend the delicate sensibilities of the neighbors. And the undisputed queen of Whispering Pines? That would be Brenda. Brenda is the president of the Homeowners Association. She treats this unpaid, volunteer position with the kind of ruthless authoritarian gravity usually reserved for military dictatorships. She roams the sidewalks with a clipboard, measuring the distance between parked cars and the curb. She writes citations for unauthorized shades of mulch. She is a walking, talking, breathing embodiment of middle management tyranny. And Brenda absolutely hated Betty. It started on a random Tuesday evening in late October. The sky had been spitting a miserable cold mist all afternoon. I was pulling into my driveway after a long, grueling 10-hour shift. I was tired, I was hungry, and I just wanted to go inside, take a hot shower, and eat a frozen pizza. As I turned onto my street, I flicked Betty's wiper dial to the lowest intermittent setting. Squeak thump. A pause of about 5 seconds. Squeak thump. It wasn't a grinding noise. It wasn't metal on glass. It was just the rubber of the slightly worn driver's side blade gripping the damp glass a little too enthusiastically on the return stroke. It was a minor annoyance, sure. Was it a public menace? Absolutely not. But as I pulled into my driveway, the headlights illuminated a figure standing at the edge of my property line. It was Brenda. She was wrapped in a yellow trench coat, holding her infamous clipboard, standing completely still in the mist, like a suburban grim reaper. I put the truck in park, killed the engine, and stepped out. "Evening, Brenda," I said, trying to muster a polite tone. Lovely weather we're having. Is that a joke? She snapped, her eyes narrowing behind her wire-rimmed glasses. Just trying to make conversation. Can I help you with something? Brenda tapped her pen against her clipboard. I've been observing your vehicle for the last 3 blocks. The noise emanating from your windshield clearing mechanism is unacceptable. I stared at her. My windshield clearing mechanism? You mean my wipers? They are generating a high-decibel friction noise, she stated, perfectly deadpan. It is highly disruptive. Brenda, it's a squeak. The rubber is a little cold. I'll get them replaced this weekend. That is insufficient, she replied, clicking her pen. The Whispering Pines covenants, conditions, and restrictions, Section 4, Paragraph 12, clearly state that no resident shall operate any mechanical equipment, including vehicular accessories, that produces a grating, squeaking, or otherwise disruptive auditory nuisance. I am writing you a formal citation. I let out a heavy sigh, feeling the exhaustion deep in my bones. You're writing me a ticket for a squeaky wiper blade? I am officially documenting a mechanical nuisance and a hazard, she corrected me. She aggressively scribbled on a pink triplicate form, ripped off the top copy, and shoved it toward my chest. I didn't take it. It fluttered to the wet driveway. Brenda, it's not a hazard. It clears the water perfectly fine. It just makes a little noise. If it makes a noise, it is defective, she countered, her voice rising in pitch. And operating a motor vehicle with defective safety equipment is illegal. In fact, if you do not rectify this immediately, I will be forced to escalate the matter. Escalate it to who? The wiper police? I chuckled. That was a mistake. Never laugh at a tyrant. I am calling the authorities, she declared. She literally pulled her smartphone out of her trench coat pocket right then and there. I am reporting a noise violation and a public safety hazard. You are driving a dangerously defective noise-polluting vehicle in my neighborhood. You have got to be kidding me, I muttered, shaking my head. Call them. Go ahead. Let's see what the cops have to say about a wiper blade. I picked up the damp pink slip from the driveway, walked up to my front door, went inside, and made a sandwich. I honestly didn't think she would do it. I figured it was an empty threat designed to assert dominance. 45 minutes later, I was halfway through my turkey on rye when a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the house. I opened the door to find a Seattle Police Department officer standing on my porch. He looked incredibly tired. Rain was dripping from the brim of his hat. Can I help you, officer? I asked, completely bewildered. Yeah, hi, he sighed, glancing back toward the street. Brenda was standing on her porch 2 houses down, watching us like a hawk. Are you the owner of the blue Ford F-150 in the driveway? I am. I got a dispatch call regarding it says here, a dangerously defective noise-polluting hazard. The officer looked at me, then looked at the truck. Sir, does your truck have an illegal exhaust system or something? No, officer. My truck is completely stock. I leaned against the doorframe. My HOA president called you because my windshield wipers squeak. The officer froze. He blinked slowly. He looked back at Brenda, who gave a self-satisfied little nod. Then he looked back at me. I could see the will to live actively leaving his body. Your wipers, he repeated softly. Yes. My driver's side wiper squeaks when it's on intermittent. The officer rubbed his temples. Sir, I have real crimes to deal with. There was an armed robbery 3 miles from here. I know, I said sympathetically. I didn't call you. I understand that. He pulled out his citation book. Here's the problem. She officially filed a nuisance and hazard complaint through the non-emergency line. Because she represents the HOA and cited a local noise ordinance alongside a vehicle defect, I can't just walk away without documenting it, or she's going to call my captain and complain that I'm neglecting my duties. She's done it before. Wait, you're actually going to ticket me? I asked, my voice rising in disbelief. It's a fix-it ticket, he explained, looking apologetic as he started writing. It's a formal warning. It basically says your equipment has been reported as defective, and you need to resolve the issue to maintain safe operation. It doesn't carry a fine unless you ignore it and get pulled over for it later. Just buy new blades, okay? Please. For my sanity. He handed me the yellow slip of paper. I took it, staring at the messy handwriting. Equipment warning. Windshield clearing device. Defective. Nuisance. Thanks, officer, I mumbled. He tipped his hat, trudged back to his cruiser, and drove away. I stood on the porch, looking at the yellow police warning in one hand and the pink HOA violation in the other. I looked over at Brenda. She gave me a smug, triumphant smile, turned on her heel, and walked back into her house. I didn't just feel angry. I felt a cold, calculating sense of absolute clarity. She wanted to play the bureaucratic game. She wanted to weaponize the rules against me over a minor annoyance. She forced a police officer to write a formal legal document stating that my wipers were officially classified as defective. Okay, if we are playing by the exact letter of the law, let's play. I went back inside, threw the rest of my sandwich in the trash, and walked into my home office. I fired up my laptop. I didn't search for new wiper blades. I didn't go to Amazon to buy silicone replacements. I opened a search engine and typed in Washington State Revised Code of Washington, RCW, Title 46, Motor Vehicles. If my vehicle was legally documented as having defective safety equipment by the police, what were my legal obligations as a driver to ensure the safety of pedestrians and other motorists during adverse weather conditions? I poured myself a cup of black coffee and settled in for the night. The rabbit hole was deep, and it was glorious. For the next 4 hours, I read through statutes, bylaws, and federal traffic safety guidelines. I read about lighting requirements, braking distances, and visibility mandates. I was looking for a loophole, a technicality, anything I could use to turn this situation completely upside down. And then, right around 1:30 a.m., I found it. It was so beautiful, so perfectly absurd, that I actually laughed out loud in the empty room. I found Washington State Law RCW 46.37.380, which covers horns and warning devices. The statute is quite clear. It dictates what kind of horns are allowed and what kind of sirens are illegal. But it was subsection 1 that caught my eye. It read, "The driver of a motor vehicle shall, when reasonably necessary to ensure safe operation, give audible warning with his or her horn, but shall not otherwise use such horn when upon a highway." I leaned closer to the screen. Shall give audible warning when reasonably necessary to ensure safe operation. I cross-referenced this with the Federal Highway Administration's safety guidelines regarding vehicle visibility in adverse weather. The guidelines are extensive, but they boil down to a simple principle. If a driver's primary means of visibility, that is, a clear windshield, is compromised, impaired, or deemed mechanically defective, the driver assumes a heightened legal liability. To mitigate this liability, the driver is expected to take alternative, proactive measures to warn surrounding traffic and pedestrians of their presence and potential lack of control. I looked at the yellow police warning sitting on my desk. Equipment warning. Windshield clearing device. Defective. Brenda had officially, legally documented, with police backing, that my wipers were defective. She had created a permanent record stating that my visibility was impaired. Therefore, according to the strictest interpretation of RCW 46.37.380 and federal safety guidelines, if I am driving in the rain with defective wipers, my visibility is compromised. Because my visibility is compromised, it is reasonably necessary to ensure safe operation that I warn other people of my presence. How do I warn them? With an audible warning. With my horn. I didn't just have a right to honk my horn, I had a legal obligation to do so. If I drove in the rain without my wipers functioning properly and didn't provide an audible warning, I was technically acting negligently. My mind started racing, connecting the dots, weaving the tapestry of revenge. If my wipers squeak, Brenda gets mad. If I buy new wipers, Brenda wins. But what if my wipers don't squeak anymore? What if they don't exist at all? I grabbed my keys, threw on a jacket, and walked out into the cold, dark garage. I grabbed a socket wrench. I popped the hood of Betty, unbolted the wiper arms entirely, and pulled the blades off the windshield. I tossed them into the trash can. Problem solved. The squeak was gone. The nuisance was eliminated. However, without wipers, my vehicle was now undeniably, legally, practically blind in the rain. My visibility was zero. My need to ensure safe operation via an audible warning was now absolute. Every single time it rained, I would be legally required to announce my presence to the entire neighborhood to prevent a tragic accident. But Betty's factory horn was just a sad, reedy little meep. It wasn't nearly loud enough to penetrate the heavy Seattle rain and warn the good citizens of Whispering Pines of my approach. That wouldn't be safe at all. I needed something robust. I needed something undeniable. I needed something that would rattle the fine china in Brenda's dining room. I went back to the computer and started researching pneumatic air horns, specifically those approved by the Department of Transportation for commercial heavy machinery. I wasn't going to break the law. I wasn't going to install an illegal train siren that violated decibel limits. I was going to find the absolute maximum legal threshold for an audible warning device, and I was going to install it on my truck. But I didn't want to just press the steering wheel every 5 seconds. That was tedious. That lacked finesse. I wanted the truck to do the work for me. I wanted the punishment to fit the crime perfectly. Brenda hated the rhythmic squeak of my wipers. She hated the timing of it. She hated the intermittent setting. What if I wired the new, massive DOT-approved air horn directly into the windshield wiper motor circuit? Since I didn't have wiper blades anymore, the wiper motor was just spinning uselessly. But what if, every time the wiper relay clicked over to send a pulse of electricity to the motor, every time the blades would have swept across the glass, it instead sent that electrical pulse to a high-capacity air compressor hooked up to a pair of brass trumpets mounted under the hood? Every time I turned the wiper dial to intermittent, I wouldn't get a squeak. I would get a legally mandated, perfectly timed, automated safety blast. Honk, 1, 2, 3, 4, honk, 1, 2, 3, 4. I sat back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, a slow, unhinged smile spreading across my face. It was brilliant. It was bulletproof. It was malicious compliance in its purest, most distilled form. I printed out 3 copies of the RCW 46.37.380 statute. I printed out the federal guidelines on visibility. I stapled them to the pink HOA violation and the yellow police fix-it ticket. I created a master dossier of my legal defense. The next morning, I called out of work. I had an appointment to make. I needed a professional. I needed someone who didn't ask too many questions, but knew their way around automotive wiring and high-pressure pneumatics. I needed a guy. I grabbed my keys, fired up Betty. Thankfully, it was a rare dry morning, and headed out to an industrial park on the outskirts of the city. It was time to build a weapon. The industrial park on the south side of the city was a sprawling maze of corrugated metal warehouses, cracked concrete loading docks, and chain-link fences topped with barbed wire. It was the kind of place where zoning laws were treated as mild suggestions, and the air always smelled faintly of welding ozone and burnt transmission fluid. It was beautiful. I pulled Betty into a pothole-riddled lot in front of a bay door with a faded, hand-painted sign that read, "Mike's Custom and Commercial Auto." There were no fancy waiting rooms here. There were no complimentary espresso machines or polite service advisors in polo shirts. There was just a graveyard of half-finished project cars, a towering pile of discarded tires, and heavy metal music aggressively vibrating the thin metal walls of the shop. I parked, grabbed my manila folder full of legal documents, and walked through the open bay door. "Hello?" I called out over the sound of a pneumatic impact wrench. A pair of steel-toed boots was sticking out from beneath a lifted Chevy Silverado. The impact wrench stopped spinning, and the boots slid out on a wooden creeper. The man attached to the boots sat up and wiped a streak of black grease across his forehead with a rag. This was Mike. Mike looked like a Viking who had been magically transported to the modern era and decided his true calling was building monster trucks. He had a beard that could hide a small bird, forearms the size of my thighs, and a scowl that suggested he hated everyone and everything. "What?" Mike grunted, tossing the rag onto a nearby workbench. "I need some custom electrical and pneumatic work done," I said, walking over. "And I need it done today." Mike stared at me. He looked at my khakis. He looked at my sensible waterproof jacket. He looked out the bay, door at Betty. He let out a low, rumbling laugh that sounded like a diesel engine trying to start in the cold. "Look, buddy," Mike said, standing up to his full height of what had to be 6'4". "I don't do stereos. I don't install backup cameras. If you want neon lights under your dad's pickup truck, take it to the mall." "I don't want neon lights, Mike," I said, keeping my face completely deadpan. "I want to weaponize my windshield wipers." Mike paused. He was in the middle of picking up a massive wrench, but his hand stopped mid-air. He slowly turned his head back to look at me, his eyes narrowing. "Come again?" I slapped the manila folder down on an oil-stained metal table, clearing a space between a disassembled carburetor and a stack of spark plug boxes. "I need you to install a DOT-approved commercial air horn system on my F-150, I explained, tapping the folder. "The loudest legally permissible pneumatic warning device you can legally install on a passenger vehicle without violating federal decibel limits for highway driving." "Okay," Mike said slowly, walking over to the table. "I have a set of Hadley-Bully dual-trumpet air horns in the back. They use them on long-haul Peterbilts. They put out about 120 decibels. It'll make your ears bleed if you stand too close. But why the hell do you want them on a stock F-150? "Because," I smiled, "I need you to wire the air compressor relay directly into my windshield wiper motor circuit." Mike stared at me like I had just spoken to him in ancient Aramaic. "You want me to wire a train horn to your windshield wipers?" "Exactly. So every time you spray washer fluid—" "No, Mike. Every time the wiper relay clicks over to the intermittent setting." I removed the wiper blades entirely. The motor is unhooked. I want you to take the 12-volt electrical pulse that normally tells the wiper arms to sweep across the glass, and I want you to route it to the air compressor solenoid. Every time the wiper dial is engaged, I want a deafening blast of compressed air." Mike leaned his massive hands on the table, bringing his face close to mine. "Why in the name of God's green earth would you want your truck to scream at you every 4 seconds when it rains?" "For safety, Mike." I opened the folder. HOA orders. I laid out the pink violation slip. I laid out the yellow police fix-it ticket. I laid out the highlighted copies of Washington State Revised Code of Washington, 46.37.380. Mike didn't say anything at first. He just started reading. He read the police ticket. He read the HOA complaint about the squeak. He read the state law about the legal requirement to provide an audible warning to ensure safe operation when visibility is compromised. I watched him read. I watched his eyes track back and forth across the highlighted legalese. Slowly, the scowl vanished. His jaw went slack. The corners of his mouth began to twitch. The twitch turned into a smirk, and the smirk blossomed into a massive, unhinged, booming laugh that echoed off the metal roof of the shop. "You're legally blind in the rain," Mike wheezed, slapping his knee. "Because she said your wipers were a hazard." "Exactly," I said, nodding solemnly. "And as a responsible citizen, I cannot, in good conscience, operate a motor vehicle with compromised visibility without adequately warning my fellow neighbors of my approach. It would be negligent." "You're a madman," Mike declared, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "I'm compliant." "She is going to have an aneurysm." "That is the working theory, yes. Can you build it?" Mike looked at Betty out in the parking lot. He looked back at the schematics in his head. He cracked his knuckles. "Buddy, for this level of supreme concentrated spite, I will bump my afternoon appointments. Pull her into Bay 2. The next 4 hours were a masterclass in chaotic engineering. I sat on an overturned 5-gallon bucket of joint compound and watched Mike work. He was a mechanical artist. He didn't just bolt the horns on. He engineered a masterpiece. First, we had to find a place for the air tank. You can't just run heavy-duty pneumatic horns off a standard car battery. You need compressed air. Mike grabbed a 2-gallon reinforced steel air tank and bolted it securely to the frame rail underneath the bed of the truck, right behind the rear axle. It was perfectly hidden. "We need a heavy-duty compressor," Mike muttered, digging through a massive bin of parts. He pulled out a shiny chrome cylinder. "This little guy will pump up to 150 psi. It'll repressurize the tank between blasts so you don't lose volume. You can honk this thing all the way to Portland and it won't drop a single decibel." He mounted the compressor under the hood, wiring it to a dedicated relay and a secondary fuse to ensure it wouldn't fry Betty's aging electrical system. Then came the trumpets. He unboxed the Hadley horns. They were massive, gleaming brass tubes of absolute auditory destruction. One was 16 inches long, the other was 19 inches long. The dual-tone setup was designed to create a dissonant, piercing chord that cut through highway road noise like a hot knife through butter. "Where do we put 'em?" I asked. "They won't fit behind the grill," Mike said, measuring the clearance. "We could mount them on the roof, but that's too obvious. You want the element of surprise. You want the sound to just radiate from the vehicle in all directions." He ended up fabricating a custom steel bracket and mounting the trumpets directly behind the front steel bumper, angled slightly downward so the sound waves would bounce off the asphalt and amplify outward. "All right," Mike grunted, sliding out from under the front bumper. "The plumbing is done. We have air, we have pressure. Now for the fun part. The brain." He popped off the plastic cowling beneath my steering wheel, exposing a rat's nest of factory wires. He traced the bundle coming from the turn signal and wiper stalk. "Okay, here's the wiper relay," he said, holding a small black cube. "It sends a 12-volt signal to the wiper motor on a timed interval based on where you set the dial. I'm going to intercept that wire, cut it, and splice a heavy-duty lead that runs straight to the pneumatic solenoid valve on the air tank. Will it still work if I change the speed on the dial? I asked, leaning in to watch. Oh, absolutely, Mike grinned, his teeth white against his grease-stained face. If you set the wiper dial to a slow intermittent speed, the relay clicks every 8 seconds. You get a blast every 8 seconds. If you bump it up a notch, you get a blast every 4 seconds. If you push it all the way to the fastest setting, what happens? The relay stays open. The solenoid locks open. The horns will just continuously scream until the tank runs out of air, which will take about 2 solid minutes of continuous, deafening noise. Perfect. Mike grabbed his wire strippers, stripped the casing off the factory wire with practiced ease, twisted the copper strands together with a thick red wire, and locked it down with a heat shrink connector. He hit it with a blowtorch for 2 seconds, sealing the connection. Moment of truth, Mike said, tossing the torch aside. Get in the cab. Turn the key to auxiliary power so the compressor kicks on. I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. A low, vibrating hum resonated from under the truck bed as the air compressor sprang to life, filling the steel tank with 150 pounds of pressurized air. We waited for about 60 seconds until the hum abruptly clicked off. Tank is full, Mike called out, stepping back from the truck and putting his hands over his ears. Hit the dial! I reached out and clicked the wiper stalk up 1 notch to the lowest intermittent setting. For a split second, nothing happened. The factory relay clicked silently under the dashboard. And then, the wrath of God erupted inside the garage. Bub. The sound hit me like a physical punch to the chest. It was so loud my vision actually blurred for a fraction of a second. The rearview mirror violently shook on the windshield. A wrench that Mike had left sitting on the edge of the metal table vibrated off the edge and clattered to the concrete floor. The blast lasted exactly 1 second before the relay clicked off, cutting the airflow. My ears were intensely ringing. I looked out the window. Mike was doubled over, laughing so hard he wasn't making any sound. 4 seconds passed. BWW. Another devastating blast of sound echoed off the metal walls, rattling the corrugated roof panels. I quickly clicked the dial off. The garage plunged into a ringing, echoing silence. I stepped out of the truck. My hands were actually shaking from the adrenaline of the sheer volume. Mike, I shouted, my voice sounding muffled and distant in my own ears. Mike, that is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. 122 decibels, Mike yelled back, giving me a thumbs up. Fully street legal, completely compliant with DOT regulations for commercial warning devices. I pulled out my wallet. How much do I owe you? Mike waved me off, wiping grease on his pants. Are you kidding me? You think I'm charging you for this? This is art. This is a public service. The only thing I want as payment is a full, detailed report of the exact look on her face when you drive down that street. You'll get a play-by-play, I promised, shaking his massive, calloused hand. I drove away from the shop in a state of euphoric anticipation. The trap was set. The weapon was armed. The legal defense was fully prepared. Now, all I needed was the one thing Seattle usually provided in endless, agonizing abundance. I needed rain. But in a cruel twist of meteorological irony, the Pacific Northwest decided to experience a bizarre, unseasonable dry spell. For 6 agonizing days, the sun shone brightly over whispering pines. The sky was a mocking, brilliant blue. The birds chirped. The neighbors walked their golden retrievers. And Brenda patrolled the sidewalks, unbothered, her clipboard in hand, completely unaware of the absolute sonic devastation lurking beneath the hood of my battered blue truck. It was psychological warfare. Every morning, I would check my weather app before I even got out of bed. Monday. Sunny, 0% chance of precipitation. Tuesday. Partly cloudy, 0% chance of precipitation. Wednesday. Clear skies, 10% chance of precipitation. I drove to work in total silence. Without wiper blades, the truck looked a little odd, but nobody noticed. I passed Brenda twice during that week. Once, she was measuring the height of Mr. Henderson's rose bushes. The other time, she was taping a sternly worded notice about recycling bin placement to a telephone pole. Both times, she looked at my truck, looked at me, and gave a smug, superior little smirk, clearly assuming her police intervention had successfully cowed me into submission. I just smiled back, a calm, serene, terrifying smile. Just you wait, Brenda. Finally, on Sunday afternoon, the atmospheric pressure dropped. I was sitting in my living room, watching television, when the sky outside the window began to turn a bruised, heavy purple. The wind picked up, rattling the window panes and sending dead leaves skittering aggressively across the manicured lawns of the cul-de-sac. I pulled up the weather radar on my phone. A massive swirling green and yellow blob was moving rapidly off the Puget Sound, making a direct beeline for our neighborhood. Severe thunderstorm warning. Heavy rain expected in 15 minutes. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was time. I grabbed my keys, grabbed my manila folder of legal defense, and practically sprinted out to the driveway. I climbed into Betty, fired up the engine, and backed out into the street. I didn't want to just be sitting in my driveway when it started. That lacked dramatic flair. I drove 2 blocks away, parked on a side street near the entrance to the Whispering Pines subdivision, and left the engine idling. I rolled down the window slightly to smell the air. It smelled like wet asphalt and electricity. I reached down and turned the key to auxiliary. Beneath the bed, the compressor hummed to life, filling the tank. Thump, 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 thump. 150 pounds of pure spite, locking and loading. The compressor clicked off. I waited. 10 minutes passed. The sky grew darker. The streetlights flickered on prematurely, confused by the sudden gloom. And then a single, fat drop of water hit the windshield. Smack. Then another. Smack. Smack. Within 30 seconds, the skies opened up. It wasn't a drizzle. It was a torrential, blinding downpour. The street instantly slicked over with water. The visibility plummeted to less than 50 feet. It was the exact, specific condition federal guidelines warned about. I shifted the truck into drive. I rolled slowly toward my street. My windshield was rapidly covering in water, distorting the view. I couldn't see perfectly. It was, legally speaking, a highly unsafe driving condition. I turned onto my street. Through the blurred glass, I could see Brenda's house. And by some miracle of perfect cinematic timing, Brenda was outside. She was wearing her yellow trench coat, frantically trying to drag her expensive wicker patio furniture under the awning of her porch to save it from the deluge. I took a deep breath. I gripped the steering wheel. I reached out with my right hand, grabbed the wiper stalk, and clicked it up 1 notch to the lowest intermittent setting. The relay under the dash clicked. Babu. The sound tore through the quiet suburban street like a physical shock wave. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I saw Brenda violently flinch, dropping a wicker chair onto her own foot. She whipped her head around, looking frantically up and down the street, expecting to see a runaway 18-wheeler barreling through the neighborhood. All she saw was my blue F-150 rolling forward at a perfectly legal 10 miles per hour. 4 seconds of silence, filled only by the pounding rain. The relay clicked again. This time, a flock of pigeons resting on a nearby roof exploded into the air in sheer panic. A porch light flicked on 2 houses down. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead, both hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, a look of profound, solemn concentration on my face. I was just a man, doing his civic duty, warning the populace of my visually impaired approach. I rolled past Brenda's house. Brenda dropped the other chair, marched straight out into the pouring rain, and began waving her arms wildly. I couldn't hear a word she was saying over the storm and the ringing in my ears, but I could read her lips. She was screaming, her face a mask of absolute, unhinged fury. I politely waved back. I tapped the side of my head, pointed at my eyes, and shook my head sadly, pantomiming that I couldn't see well. Bwah! I pulled into my driveway. I put the truck in park. But I didn't turn it off. I just sat there. The engine idled, the rain poured, and every 4 seconds the Hadley Bully dual trumpet air horns delivered a perfectly timed 120 decibel sermon to the entire neighborhood. Babiwa! Within 2 minutes, chaos erupted. Doors were opening up and down the street. Neighbors were stepping out onto their porches, wrapping their robes tight, pointing at my truck in total bewilderment. Brenda was marching down the sidewalk toward my house, moving with the terrifying speed of a highly motivated toddler. She marched right up to my driver's side window and began pounding on the glass. I waited for the horn to finish its current cycle. As the echo faded, I rolled the window down exactly 2 inches. "Turn that off!" she shrieked, her hair plastered to her face, water streaming down her glasses. "Turn it off right now!" "I can't, Brenda," I yelled back, cupping my hands around my mouth. "It's raining." "What does that have to do with a train horn?" "My wipers are defective. I have compromised visibility." The relay clicked. Bwah! Brenda clamped both hands over her ears, her eyes squeezed shut in agony. "I am just following the law, Brenda. I am ensuring safe operation," I screamed. "I am calling the police," she bellowed, pulling her phone out of her soaked coat pocket. "I am having you arrested for disturbing the peace." "Excellent. Tell them I'm exercising my RCW 46.37.380 mandates." I rolled the window back up, turned the key off, and finally killed the engine and the wiper relay. The sudden silence in the truck was deafening, broken only by the heavy drumming of the rain on the roof. I gathered my manila folder, zipped my jacket, stepped out of the truck, and walked past a hyperventilating Brenda to my front porch. I pulled a lawn chair out of the corner, unfolded it, sat down, and waited. This was going to be the best conversation I ever had with a police officer. 20 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of a Seattle police cruiser cut through the gloom of the storm. The cruiser pulled to a stop directly in front of my house, blocking the street. The door opened, and a figure stepped out. Even through the rain, I recognized the posture. It was the exact same cop from last week. He looked even more tired than before. He looked like a man who was seriously questioning every life choice that had led him to this specific cul-de-sac. Brenda immediately ambushed him. She ran off her porch and intercepted him in the middle of the street, gesturing wildly at my truck, her arms flailing, her mouth moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour. The cop stood in the rain, letting her vent, nodding slowly, his face completely devoid of emotion. Eventually, he held up a hand, stopping her tirade. He pointed at her house, clearly telling her to go back inside. Brenda crossed her arms, shook her head furiously, and stood her ground on the sidewalk, pointing an accusing finger at me. The cop sighed, adjusted his duty belt, and walked up my driveway. I stood up from my lawn chair. "Evening, officer. Nasty weather." The cop stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs. He wiped the rain from his eyes. He looked at me. He looked at the truck. "Sir," he said, his voice flat, exhausted, and devoid of any patience. "Dispatch told me there was a man aggressively blowing a train horn in a residential neighborhood for 20 solid minutes." "That is incorrect, officer," I said calmly. "It was only about 3 minutes, and it is not a train horn. It is a DOT-approved commercial pneumatic warning device." "Why?" he asked, closing his eyes for a brief second. "Are you blowing a commercial pneumatic warning device in a residential neighborhood?" I picked up the manila folder from the lawn chair. I walked down the steps and handed it to him. "Because of you, officer," I said politely. "And because of her." He looked down at the folder. "What is this?" "Open it." He flipped open the wet cardboard cover. The first thing on top was the yellow fix-it ticket he had written me the previous week. He stared at his own handwriting. "This is the equipment warning I issued you for the squeaky wipers," he said, confused. "Correct. You officially, legally documented that my windshield clearing device was defective. Because of this official police documentation, I realized I was operating a vehicle with a severely compromised safety feature." I reached over and flipped to the next page in the folder. "This is Washington State Law RCW 46.37.380, subsection 1. I highlighted it for you." The cop squinted at the paper through the rain. He read it out loud, his voice barely audible over the storm. "The driver of a motor vehicle shall, when reasonably necessary to ensure safe operation, give audible warning with his or her horn." He stopped reading. He looked up at my windshield. He noticed, for the first time, that the wiper arms were completely bare. "Where are your wiper blades?" he asked, his voice suddenly sounding very small. "I removed them, officer, to comply with the HOA's demand that I cease the auditory nuisance of the squeak. However, as a result, I am now legally blind in adverse weather conditions. My visibility is 0. I tapped the paper in his hand. According to state law, and cross-referenced with federal highway safety mandates on page 3, because my primary visibility is compromised, a fact you yourself documented last week, it is reasonably necessary for me to give an audible warning to ensure safe operation and protect pedestrians while driving in the rain." The cop just stared at me. The rain dripped off his nose. "So," I concluded, smiling warmly, "I automated the process. Every time I engage the wiper circuit, the vehicle fulfills its legal obligation to warn the public of my visually impaired approach. I am simply following the law, exactly as written, exactly as Brenda demanded." The cop looked at the paper. He looked at the empty wiper arms. He looked back at Brenda, who was glaring at us from the sidewalk, her arms crossed, waiting for him to put me in handcuffs. The cop covered his mouth with his hand. His shoulders began to shake. He turned away from me, facing the street, and I realized he was laughing. He was laughing so hard he was silently hyperventilating in the rain. He stood there for a full 30 seconds, his back shaking, trying to compose himself. Finally, he turned back around. His eyes were watering, though it might have just been the rain. He handed the folder back to me. "Sir," the cop said, struggling to keep his voice completely professional, "your understanding of the state vehicle code is incredibly thorough. I take safety very seriously, officer. I can see that." The cop cleared his throat, wiped his face, and walked over to Brenda. I leaned against the porch railing to watch the show. "Officer," Brenda demanded as he approached, "are you going to arrest him? Are you going to tow that menace of a vehicle?" "Ma'am," the cop said loudly, ensuring I could hear him, "I cannot write him a citation." Brenda's jaw dropped. "What? Why not? He is violating the noise ordinance. He is disturbing this peace." "Actually, ma'am, he isn't. He is operating a legally compliant safety device to mitigate a documented equipment defect. A defect, I might add, that you insisted I document last week." But it's a train horn," she sputtered. "It's a DOT-approved air horn," the cop corrected her. "And state law mandates he use it when his visibility is compromised. Since he has no wipers, his visibility is compromised. He is legally obligated to honk that horn every time he drives in the rain." Brenda stared at him, her brain clearly short-circuiting as the absolute bureaucratic checkmate washed over her. "You're telling me," Brenda whispered, her voice trembling with rage, "that he is legally allowed to do that?" "I am telling you, ma'am," the cop replied, perfectly deadpan, "that he is legally required to do that." The cop turned around, walked back to his cruiser, opened the door, and paused. He looked back at me standing on the porch. He didn't smile, but he gave me a slow, deliberate salute, with 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. Then he got in his car and drove away, leaving Brenda standing alone in the pouring rain, completely and utterly defeated by her own rule book. The rain in Seattle didn't stop that night. In fact, it rained consistently for the next 3 solid days. And for 3 solid days, I became the most unavoidable, inescapable phenomenon in Whispering Pines. Honestly, I almost started feeling bad for the other neighbors. Almost. Every morning at precisely 7:15 a.m., I would pull out of my driveway to head to the office. The sky would be a miserable weeping gray. I would turn the wiper stalk to the intermittent setting, and the Hadley Bully air horns would declare my departure to the heavens. Every 4 seconds, all the way down the street, all the way past the manicured roundabouts, all the way to the main arterial road. By Tuesday afternoon, the neighborhood Facebook group had devolved into absolute anarchy. My phone was blowing up with notifications from the Whispering Pines Community Board. Half the neighborhood thought it was the end of days, the other half was thoroughly entertained. Mr. Henderson, the guy with the prized rose bushes, actually posted a video of me driving by with the caption, "At least he's being safe," accompanied by the crying laughing emoji. But Brenda was spiraling. I drove past her house on Wednesday evening during a particularly nasty squall. I saw her literally standing in her living room window, pressing what looked like a thick acoustic foam panel against the glass. The bags under her eyes were visible from the street. She looked like a woman who was slowly being dismantled by her own hubris. I gave her a cheerful, legally mandated 120 decibel honk as I rolled by. On Thursday, the rain finally broke, replaced by a sullen, overcast sky. That afternoon, I found a certified letter taped to my front door. It was printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock, bearing the official crest of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. It was a summons. An emergency, mandatory tribunal had been called for Saturday morning at the community clubhouse. The agenda: immediate resolution of the vehicular noise disturbance at Lot 42, up to and including community expulsion, vehicle towing at the owner's expense, and maximum punitive fines. I smiled, pulling the tape off the door. This was it. The main event. The arena where the sovereign ruling brand truly thrives. You don't just beat a petty tyrant in the streets. You drag them into their own bureaucratic coliseum and beat them with their own rule book. I spent Friday evening preparing my defense. I didn't just bring the paperwork. I went to a local office supply store and bought a large, portable dry erase whiteboard, a set of multicolored markers, and a telescopic metal pointer. If Brenda wanted a formal hearing, I was going to give her a full-blown masterclass in malicious compliance. Saturday morning arrived. The Whispering Pines clubhouse was a sterile, aggressively beige building that permanently smelled of chlorine from the adjacent community pool and cheap filter coffee. I walked into the main meeting room at exactly 8:55 a.m., carrying my whiteboard and a thick leather binder. The room was set up like a courtroom. At the front, sitting behind a long folding table, was the HOA board. There were 3 of them. On the left was Gary, a retired accountant who always looked like he was desperately trying to avoid conflict. On the right was Linda, a nervous woman who constantly applied lip balm. And in the center, gripping a wooden gavel with white-knuckled intensity, was Brenda. Behind them, filling the rows of cheap plastic chairs, were about 30 residents of Whispering Pines. Word had gotten around. Half the neighborhood had shown up to see how this ridiculous standoff was going to end. The room went dead silent as I walked down the center aisle. I set up my whiteboard on an easel facing the board, took a seat at the small table provided for me, and opened my binder. "Let's get this over with," Brenda snapped, slamming her gavel down harder than necessary. "This emergency meeting of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association is now in order. We are here to address the deliberate, malicious, and frankly terroristic noise violations committed by the resident of Lot 42. She glared at me, her eyes practically vibrating with exhaustion and rage. "Over the past week," Brenda continued, addressing the crowd and the board, "this individual has intentionally circumvented our community noise ordinances by installing a commercial train horn on his vehicle and deploying it relentlessly. It has disrupted our peace, traumatized our pets, and lowered our property values. I am motioning for an immediate maximum fine of $500 per day of violation, the immediate towing of the offending vehicle, and initiating the process for community expulsion." A murmur ran through the crowd. Gary looked down at his hands. Linda frantically applied more lip balm. "Do you have anything to say for yourself before we vote on this motion?" Brenda demanded, pointing her gavel at me. I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. I picked up my telescopic metal pointer, gave it a sharp flick so it extended to its full length, and walked over to my whiteboard. "I have quite a bit to say, actually," I began, pitching my voice to the back of the room so everyone could hear. "But first, I'd like to ask the president of the board a very simple, direct question. Brenda, on the evening of October 14th, did you or did you not file an official complaint with the Seattle Police Department regarding my vehicle?" Brenda crossed her arms defensively. "I reported a noise violation and a mechanical hazard. Your wipers were emitting a disruptive screech. They were defective." "Ah," I said, tapping the whiteboard with my pointer. I wrote the word defective in large red letters. You explicitly told the police that my windshield clearing device was defective. Yes, she said, sounding exasperated. Because they were. And because of your report, the responding officer was legally obligated to write me an official equipment warning. I pulled the yellow slip from my binder and held it up for the room to see. This is a police-issued document. It formally classifies my vehicle as having a defective windshield clearing device. Now, I am a law-abiding citizen. When the police tell me my safety equipment is defective, I take that very seriously. I turned to the board. Gary, Linda, are you familiar with the Federal Highway Administration safety guidelines regarding vehicle visibility in adverse weather? Gary blinked. No. Not really. It's fascinating reading, I said, flipping a page in my binder. Federal guidelines state that if a driver's primary means of visibility is compromised, the driver assumes a heightened legal liability. To mitigate this liability and protect the public, the driver must take proactive measures to warn surrounding traffic and pedestrians of their presence. I wrote compromised visibility equals heightened liability on the whiteboard in blue marker. Now, I continued, pacing in front of the board, I didn't want to be a liability to my wonderful neighbors, but my wipers were officially deemed defective by this very HOA and the Seattle police. I couldn't use them. So I removed them completely to eliminate the squeak that Brenda so deeply hated. I solved the HOA noise violation. You replaced a squeak with a sonic boom, Brenda shouted, standing up from her chair. I replaced a squeak with legal compliance, I shot back, my voice echoing off the clubhouse walls. I pulled out my copies of the Washington State Vehicle Code. This brings us to the crux of the matter. Washington State Law, RCW 46.37.380. I have provided copies for the board. I slid the papers across the table to Gary and Linda. Brenda refused to look at hers. Let me read. Subsection 1 for the record, I said, my voice dripping with theatrical gravity. The driver of a motor vehicle shall, when reasonably necessary to ensure safe operation, give audible warning with his or her horn. It doesn't say may, it says shall. It is a legal mandate. I turned back to the whiteboard and wrote, Legal mandate. Audible warning in thick black letters, underlining it twice. I looked at the crowd. They were completely captivated. A few people in the back were actually grinning. Let's follow the logic, I said, using my pointer to trace the words on the board. Brenda used her authority to legally document that my visibility equipment was defective. Because my visibility is defective, I am legally blind in the rain. Because I am legally blind in the rain, state law mandates that I provide an audible warning to ensure safe operation. If I drive down these streets in the pouring rain without wipers and without sounding a horn, I am actively violating state law and endangering the public. I leaned over the folding table, looking directly into Brenda's furious, sleep-deprived eyes. Are you, as the president of this HOA, officially demanding that I violate Washington state traffic laws and federal safety mandates? The room fell so quiet you could hear the hum of the vending machine in the hallway. Brenda opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She looked at Gary. Gary looked terrified. She looked at Linda. Linda was staring at the state law document like it was a live grenade. This is absurd, Brenda finally sputtered, her face turning a deep shade of crimson. You wired an air compressor to your steering column. You engineered this just to torture me. I automated a legally mandated safety procedure to ensure I never accidentally forgot to warn my neighbors of my impaired approach, I corrected her calmly, stepping back from the table. "I did it for the community, Brenda. I did it for the children." A guy in the third row actually snorted with laughter and had to cover his mouth. "Now," I said, clapping my hands together, "let's talk about the HOA's legal exposure here. Because if you attempt to fine me, or if you attempt to tow my vehicle for complying with state traffic laws, my attorney will not only sue the HOA for illegal retaliation, but we will personally subpoena the board members for encouraging negligent driving practices." Gary visibly flinched. He leaned over to Brenda and frantically whispered something in her ear. Brenda swatted him away, but the panic was starting to set in. She was cornered. She had tried to use the bureaucracy as a weapon, and I had just dropped a bureaucratic nuclear bomb on her folding table. "However," I said, softening my tone, playing the reasonable, benevolent victor, "I don't want to bankrupt the HOA. I live here. I value our community. I want peace just as much as you do." I picked up an eraser and wiped the whiteboard clean. "I am prepared to offer a settlement," I announced. "Right here, right now. We can end all of this today." Brenda gripped her gavel, her knuckles white. "What kind of settlement?" I pulled a single sheet of paper from the back of my binder and laid it gently on the table. "3 simple terms," I said, holding up 3 fingers. "Term number 1, the HOA officially and permanently revokes the noise violation regarding my windshield wipers, striking it entirely from the community record." Gary nodded vigorously. "Done. Absolutely." "Term number 2, I continued, looking directly at Brenda. "Because my original wiper blades were removed due to your police intervention, you will personally purchase a brand new set of premium, high-performance silicone wiper blades for a 2008 Ford F-150, specifically the Bosch Icon series. They cost about $35 each. They are guaranteed to be entirely silent." Brenda's eye twitched. "You want me to buy your car parts?" "I want you to restore the safety equipment you compelled me to remove," I corrected. "And finally, term number 3. I tapped the paper I had placed on the table. "You will sign this document. It is a formal, written apology, acknowledging that you misused HOA resources and police time to pursue a petty personal grievance over a minor mechanical squeak, and you promise to never harass me regarding my vehicle again." "I will never sign that!" Brenda shrieked, slamming her hand on the table. "You are extorting me!" "I'm offering you a way out," I said coldly, dropping these. "Friendly facade. Because if you don't sign it, and you don't buy those wipers, I will leave this meeting, I will get back in my truck, and I will pray for rain. And the forecast for tomorrow, Brenda? It's calling for heavy showers all afternoon. I will drive up and down this cul-de-sac from dawn until dusk, legally ensuring safe operation." The crowd in the clubhouse erupted. A woman in the front row, the one who lived next door to Brenda, actually stood up. "Sign the paper, Brenda," she yelled. "I swear to God, if I have to listen to that horn one more time, I'm withholding my HOA dues." "Sign it," Mr. Henderson echoed from the back. "He beat you! Just buy the man his wipers." Brenda looked at the crowd. They were entirely against her. She looked at Gary and Linda. They were staring at her with desperate, pleading eyes, silently begging her to surrender. She looked back at me, standing calmly by my whiteboard, the master of the sovereign ruling domain. She had no power here. Not anymore. Slowly, her shoulders slumped. The authoritarian rigidity drained out of her body, leaving her looking small, exhausted, and utterly defeated. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a pen, and snatched the paper off the table. She signed her name so hard, the pen tore through the bottom of the page. "Gary will cut you a check for the wipers from the petty cash fund," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No," I said firmly. "The terms state you buy them personally. I'll take Venmo or cash." Brenda stared at me with a hatred so pure it could have melted steel. She reached into her designer purse, pulled out her wallet, aggressively counted out 4 $20 bills, and threw them across the table. They fluttered down onto my binder. "Are we done here?" she asked bitterly. "We are," I smiled, sweeping the cash into my pocket and picking up the signed apology. "Thank you for your dedication to community safety, Brenda. Meeting adjourned." I packed up my whiteboard, closed my binder, and walked down the center aisle. The crowd actually parted for me. A few people clapped me on the shoulder as I walked past. It felt like walking out of the Super Bowl after throwing the game-winning touchdown. I didn't even go straight home. I drove directly to the nearest auto parts store. I walked into the aisles, found the premium Bosch Icon silicone blades, and bought them with Brenda's money. When I got back to my driveway, the sky was starting to darken again. The clouds were gathering, pregnant with the promise of more Seattle rain. I popped the hood of Betty. I didn't disconnect the air horns. Mike did too good of a job, and frankly, I wanted to keep them for highway emergencies. But I did snip the bypass wire leading to the wiper relay, taping it off securely. The automated weapon was disarmed. Then, I snapped the sleek, brand-new silicone wiper blades onto the metal arms. They clicked into place perfectly. I climbed into the cab, turned the key to auxiliary, and sprayed a heavy dose of washer fluid onto the dry windshield. I reached out and clicked the wiper stalk up to the intermittent setting. The blades swept across the glass. They were completely, perfectly, beautifully silent. No squeak, no thump. Just the quiet, efficient swish of premium rubber clearing the glass. I sat there for a moment, listening to the quiet. I looked out the window down the street. Brenda's house was dark. Her blinds were drawn. The neighborhood was at peace. I had been legally mandated to cause chaos, and through that chaos, I had found absolute tranquility. So remember this, folks. When someone tries to use the fine print to make your life miserable over a squeak, don't get mad. Don't throw a tantrum. Just dive into the rulebook, find the loophole they didn't see coming, and get unimaginably louder. Always read the state vehicle code. Let them choke on their own bureaucracy. Stay compliant, stay petty, and I'll see you in the next one.